The dawn of March 18, 1943, unfolded much like any preceding training period at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley intently observed his cadre of dive bomber trainees as they ascended into the cockpits of their SPD Dauntless aircraft, formidable machines that had decisively altered the trajectory of the war at Midway merely 9 months prior. Yet, an alarming discrepancy marred the routine. Over the preceding 6 weeks, Flatley had tragically witnessed the loss of more aviators to training mishaps than he had experienced in actual combat throughout the entirety of the Guadalcanal campaign. This emerging pattern was both undeniable and deeply unsettling. These incidents were not attributable to novice errors or mechanical malfunctions. Seasoned pilots, individuals who had already endured and survived the crucible of combat missions, were executing textbook-perfect dive bombing maneuvers directly into the unforgiving expanse of the ocean. Dispatches from other training facilities across the nation corroborated this disturbing narrative. At NAS Corpus Christi, at NAS Pensacola, and at airfields nationwide, dive bomber pilots were perishing under circumstances that defied all tactical rationale. They would flawlessly execute their roll into an inverted position, seamlessly transition into their dive, maintain the precise 70-degree angle mandated by operational doctrine, and meticulously track their targets through the bomb site, only to inexplicably fail to initiate recovery. No frantic radio transmissions signaling distress were ever received. No erratic aerial acrobatics hinted at control system failures. The aircraft would steadfastly maintain its steep descent angle past the designated bomb release point, past the critical safe pullout altitude, until the unyielding forces of physics rendered any hope of recovery utterly impossible. Subsequent crash investigations consistently revealed intact control surfaces, engines operating flawlessly, and airframes devoid of damage save for the catastrophic impact. It was as if the pilots had succumbed to slumber at the most perilous juncture. However, they were not merely asleep. The phenomenon unfolding within those cockpits was far more insidious than simple fatigue. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had, since late 1942, been inundated with disquieting field reports, but the sheer magnitude of the predicament only became unequivocally apparent when squadron after squadron began losing pilots to what official communiques euphemistically termed failure to recover from dive. This carefully chosen phrase thinly veiled a harsher, more unpalatable truth that no one was eager to confront. The very dive bombing methodology that had clinched victory at the Battle of Midway was now systematically claiming the lives of the very men who had so assiduously mastered its intricacies. The inherent precision and rigorous discipline that rendered dive bombing so devastatingly effective against Japanese carriers had, paradoxically, forged a physiological trap that the delicate architecture of human biology was simply unequipped to withstand. Commander Flatley commenced a diligent comparison of notes with his counterparts at other training commands, and a profoundly disturbing consensus swiftly emerged. The pilots who were tragically perishing were not the careless individuals who habitually cut corners, or the reckless daredevils who habitually pushed beyond their established limitations. On the contrary, they were the meticulously precise, by-the-book aviators who rigorously adhered to doctrine as prescribed, the very individuals who prolonged their dives to the absolute last possible second to guarantee maximal accuracy, the ones who had internalized the brutal mathematical realities of dive bombing. Every 100 feet of additional altitude at the point of bomb release translated into dozens of feet of potential deviation from the target. Against a rapidly maneuvering warship, such a minute missed distance could spell the crucial difference between a devastating hit and a wasted ordnance. Consequently, these pilots had assiduously trained themselves to wait, to hold that screaming descent, to keep the target immovably centered in their sights until the absolute final instant before initiating their pullout. And that unwavering discipline, that profound commitment to unerring accuracy, was now killing them in numbers that gravely imperiled the operational viability of the entire dive bomber force. What had not been adequately calculated or comprehended was the profound physiological impact upon the human body when a 2-ton aircraft transitions from a precipitous 70-degree dive at 300 miles per hour into a violently curving recovery arc. The aerodynamic mathematics were straightforward and easily quantifiable. The biological physiology, however, proved to be anything but. When a pilot exerted force upon the control stick to commence the pull-out maneuver, he was not merely altering the aircraft's trajectory. He was simultaneously subjecting his entire circulatory system to gravitational forces it had never evolved to endure. At the nadir of a typical dive bombing pullout, pilots routinely experience between 5 and 7 gs of acceleration, meaning their blood instantaneously weighed 5 to 7 times its normal mass. That blood, obedient to the merciless and immutable laws of physics, was forcefully drained away from the brain and gravitationally pulled in the lower extremities and legs. This sequence of events transpired with a rapidity that conscious thought could scarcely track. First manifested the loss of peripheral vision, a phenomenon aviators colloquially termed grayout. The outermost edges of the visual field would perceptibly fade into a colorless, indistinct fog as the retinas, critically deprived of oxygen-rich blood, began to cease functioning from the periphery inward. This initial symptom typically occurred at approximately 4 gs and afforded the pilot perhaps a mere 2 seconds of anticipatory warning. This was swiftly followed by tunnel vision, where only the central portion of the visual field remained functional, progressively constricting into a narrow, circular aperture that rendered the accurate reading of flight instruments nearly impossible. At 5.5 gs, the vast majority of pilots would experience complete blackout, a total and absolute cessation of vision while technically retaining a fragile thread of consciousness. At 6 gs and beyond, consciousness itself would inexorably slip away. The brain, receiving perhaps a mere 30% of its normal blood flow, would simply shut down as an innate, self-preservatory mechanism. Herein lay the profound treachery inherent in dive bombing. The entirety of the pull-out maneuver, from its initiation to the achievement of wings-level flight, typically consumed a fleeting 4 to 6 seconds. However, G-induced blackout could commence in less than 2 seconds, and complete unconsciousness could follow within a mere 4. The timing was nothing short of catastrophic. A pilot would initiate his pullout, acutely sense the escalating G-forces, perceive his vision beginning to narrow and dim, and then his conscious mind would tragically vanish precisely at the moment of its most critical necessity. The control stick would become slack, the pullout would involuntarily halt midway through its arc, and the aircraft would continue its uncontrolled descent into the watery abyss with an incapacitated pilot at the controls. Even more agonizingly, when the crushing G-forces finally abated, either because the aircraft entered a terminal spiral or simply because it impacted the water, consciousness would sometimes fleetingly return in that final, terrifying second, granting the pilot just enough awareness to fully comprehend the horrifying inevitability of his imminent demise. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine subsequently conducted rigorous tests at the centrifuge facilities situated in Pensacola, subjecting volunteer pilots to the exact G profiles meticulously measured during actual dive bombing pullouts. The findings proved profoundly sobering. When pilots were explicitly forewarned of impending high G forces and instructed to tense their leg and abdominal muscles, a physiological technique known to delay blackout by a crucial second or two, they could, indeed, maintain consciousness through pullouts that would otherwise render them completely unconscious. However, in the unforgiving reality of actual flight during the culminating seconds of a dive, with a designated target rushing relentlessly upwards, and with their attention utterly fixated on maintaining the bomb site's pipper precisely centered. Pilots invariably forgot to perform the essential anti-G straining maneuvers. Their conscious minds were simply too saturated with the demanding tasks at hand. By the time they finally initiated the pullout, it was already irrevocably too late to adequately prepare their bodies for the crushing physiological onslaught that was rapidly approaching. A striking parallel to this very problem had been encountered by the Germans 4 years earlier, and their ensuing solution proved to be as brutal as it was remarkably effective. In 1939, during the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka's initial combat trials over the battlefields of Poland, the Luftwaffe tragically lost 7 aircraft within a single week to a baffling series of unexplained dive accidents. Pilots, who had flawlessly executed their maneuvers in training, were inexplicably plunging straight into the Polish farmland, with their bombs still meticulously attached. The subsequent investigation unequivocally revealed that experienced pilots were blacking out during pullouts at rates that rendered the Stuka operationally unsustainable. However, unlike the Americans who would confront this identical crisis years later, the Germans benefited from the direct involvement of an engineer named Hans Ulrich Rudd, who collaborated intimately with the design teams at Junkers. And Rudd vehemently advocated for a solution that entirely circumvented the fallibility of the human element. By early 1940, every Stuka rolling off the production line came factory-equipped with a sophisticated automatic pull-out system. The underlying mechanism was ingeniously simple yet profoundly effective. The pilot would preset a desired recovery altitude on a barometric switch before commencing his dive, and upon the aircraft reaching that precise altitude, pneumatic actuators would automatically and forcefully haul the control column backward, entirely irrespective of the pilot's current actions or state. Even if the pilot was completely unconscious, even if he had entirely relinquished his grip on the control stick, the aircraft would autonomously extract itself from the perilous dive. The system incorporated a crucial mechanical override, a prominently positioned large red handle that the pilot could pull to regain manual control. However, that override necessitated a conscious, deliberate decision. If the pilot had blacked out, the automation would unfailingly save his life without requiring any input from him whatsoever. The consequences of this innovation were both immediate and profoundly dramatic. Stuka loss rates attributable to dive accidents plummeted by over 80% within a mere 3 months of the system's widespread deployment. Pilots recounted experiencing the control stick forcefully wrenching itself backward during pullouts they barely remembered initiating. Some aviators described regaining full consciousness in level flight with absolutely no recollection of the preceding 5 seconds of their flight. The automatic system unexpectedly yielded a secondary benefit that no one had initially anticipated. It empowered pilots to prolong their dives for greater durations. The reassuring knowledge that the aircraft would independently recover itself at a preset altitude meant pilots could maintain their bomb sights locked onto the target through the final, crucial seconds without the added burden of worrying about the precise timing of initiating their pullout. They could dedicate their entire focus to achieving maximum accuracy, implicitly trusting the mechanical system to safeguard them from the potentially fatal physiological consequences. Nevertheless, when American intelligence officers meticulously examined captured Stukas in North Africa throughout 1941 and 1942, they regrettably dismissed the automatic pull-out system as merely characteristic German over-engineering. The American aviation community harbored a deep-seated cultural skepticism toward automation in flight. The prevailing ethos dictated that pilots were unequivocally meant to fly their aircraft, not permit machines to perform that essential function for them. The entrenched attitude was that properly trained aviators should not require mechanical assistance to avert blacking out. They should, quite simply, be superior pilots. This deeply ingrained philosophy persisted even as the mounting pile of accident reports grew increasingly alarming. When Navy test pilots conducted an evaluation of a captured Ju-87 at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in December 1942, their report duly noted the presence of the automatic pull-out system, but erroneously characterized it as a mere crutch for pilots of insufficient skill rather than a pragmatic solution to a fundamental and critical physiological problem. That flawed assessment would tragically cost American lives for another. 8 agonizing months before the harsh realities of combat losses finally compelled a necessary and overdue doctrinal shift. The USS Yorktown's Air Group 3 had cultivated an esteemed reputation for its exceptional precision and formidable combat prowess. These aviators were far from inexperienced trainees. They were seasoned veterans, having honed their lethal skills during the arduous Solomons campaign, capable of depositing a 1,000-pound ordnance package squarely onto a destroyer's deck from an astonishing altitude of 10,000 feet. Yet, on the somber day of March 22, 1943, during what was intended to be a routine training maneuver off the sun-drenched Florida coast, Lieutenant Robertson failed to execute his pullout from a dive. His wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, observed with growing horror as Chen's Dauntless maintained its steep angle, plunging past the designated bomb release point, past the critical altitude where recovery should have commenced, until it violently impacted the ocean surface in a vertical plunge, leaving scarcely any salvageable wreckage. Chen's tragic demise marked the squadron's third fatality within a mere 2-week span, and chillingly, he would not be the last. Just 5 days later, Lieutenant William Stamper initiated his dive during an identical training exercise. His radio remained eerily silent. His aircraft steadfastly adhered to its fatal trajectory. Observers positioned on the Yorktown's deck watched through powerful binoculars as Stamper's SPD continued its relentless descent past every altitude marker, anticipating a pullout that never materialized. The subsequent impact unleashed a towering plume of white water, visible for many miles across the seascape. Stamper, remarkably, had been Chen's own flight instructor. He had valiantly survived the brutal carrier engagements at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, accumulating over 300 carrier landings, a testament to his expertise, only to perish during a training drill he could have executed effortlessly in his sleep. Upon the squadron's return to the Yorktown that afternoon, the commanding officer immediately grounded the entire dive bomber element, pending an urgent and thorough investigation. Admiral Mark Mitcher, the formidable commander overseeing fast carrier task force operations, had witnessed enough of these devastating losses. He promptly issued a directive to the Bureau of Aeronautics, demanding that these recurring incidents no longer be dismissed as isolated misfortunes, but instead be confronted as a pervasive, systemic crisis. The exhaustive investigation that ensued meticulously compiled data from every Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron actively operating across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters of war. The resultant statistics were nothing short of staggering. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the United States Navy had tragically lost 47 dive bomber pilots solely due to pull-out failures during training operations, a number that shockingly surpassed the total loss to enemy action within the identical timeframe. Furthermore, reports from combat squadrons indicated that a concerning 15 to 20% of pilots were experiencing at least partial blackout during operational dives. Several critical combat missions had been severely compromised when section leaders abruptly lost consciousness mid-attack, forcing their vigilant wingmen to abandon their offensive maneuvers and instead escort their incapacitated comrades to safety. In response to this escalating emergency, the Bureau swiftly convened an urgent panel at the Anacostia Naval Air Station. This distinguished assembly brought together a diverse group of experts, including leading flight surgeons, innovative aircraft designers, seasoned combat squadron leaders, and crucially, pilots who had miraculously survived blackout incidents. For 3 intense days in early April, these specialists meticulously dissected every established principle and assumption they held regarding dive bombing technique. Test pilots bravely flew instrumented dives, equipped with sophisticated medical monitoring apparatus strapped to their chests, meticulously recording precise data on heart rate, blood pressure, and blood oxygen levels during each distinct phase of the dive and subsequent pullout. High-speed cameras, strategically mounted in accompanying chase aircraft, captured the exact, chilling moments when pilots' heads would slump forward or their hands would involuntarily release the control stick. The accumulated evidence was utterly irrefutable. The standard dive bombing profile, as meticulously taught in every Navy flight school across the nation, was fundamentally physiologically unsustainable. Pilots were, in essence, being trained to execute a maneuver that the limits of human biology could not reliably endure. A profound doctrinal shift was imperative, yet, paradoxically, no one on that esteemed panel could reach a consensus on how to effectively modify the technique without inadvertently sacrificing the pinpoint accuracy that rendered dive bombing such an invaluable and devastatingly effective combat strategy in the first place. The pivotal breakthrough, however, emerged from an entirely unexpected quarter. It did not originate from the high-ranking admirals or the meticulous flight surgeons, but rather from a relatively junior officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Riley. Riley, a combat veteran who had been flying perilous missions off the USS Enterprise since the pivotal Battle of Midway, had begun to implement a technique that brazenly violated every established principle of dive bombing doctrine. He had, until then, kept his innovative approach a closely guarded secret, fearing he would face severe reprimand for his unconventional methods. Instead of initiating his pullout at the prescribed altitude of 2,500 feet and releasing his bomb during the initial phase of the recovery arc, Riley had consistently been holding his dives to a much lower 2,000 feet, sometimes even pushing the limits to 1,800 feet, and releasing his ordnance at this dramatically reduced altitude where his aircraft was still nearly vertical. Following the release, he would then execute a significantly more gradual pullout, effectively distributing the punishing G-forces over a more extended duration. This technique, according to the official manual, was entirely backward. Conventional wisdom dictated releasing the bomb early in the pullout to maximize recovery time. Yet, Riley's bombing scores were inexplicably superior to anyone else in his squadron, and remarkably, he had never experienced even a momentary grayout. When Riley finally elucidated his groundbreaking technique during the Anacostia Conference, the initial reaction was one of profound skepticism, bordering on outright hostility. A senior commander from the Bureau of Aeronautics flatly accused him of fabricating his release altitudes, asserting that no pilot could achieve consistent accuracy from below 2,000 feet, as the standard bombsight calculation simply did not even account for releases at such low levels. However, Riley possessed compelling evidence, gun camera footage. When the panel reviewed this crucial film, they witnessed something that directly contradicted every long-held belief they had about bombing accuracy. Riley's bombs were consistently impacting within a circular error probable, CP, of merely 35 feet, an achievement substantially superior to the 65-foot CP that was universally considered excellent for dive bombing operations. The underlying reason for this remarkable precision became strikingly clear once aerodynamicists meticulously crunched the numbers. The standard, conventional technique involved releasing the bomb early in the pull-out arc, when the aircraft was transitioning through a dive angle of perhaps 60 degrees. At this angle, the released bomb retained significant horizontal velocity, which necessitated intricate calculations and corrections. Furthermore, the effects of wind were substantial, causing the bomb's trajectory to describe a complex parabolic curve that demanded the pilot meticulously lead the target and account for a multitude of variables. In stark contrast, Riley's ultra-low releases were occurring when his aircraft was still almost perfectly vertical, plunging between 75 and 85 degrees nose down. At this extreme angle, the bomb essentially dropped almost straight down with a negligible horizontal component. Wind effects became practically inconsequential. The bomb's trajectory was, in essence, a straight line from its release point to its impact point. This ballistic simplicity, it was discovered, directly translated to enhance accuracy. The bomb sight mathematics that had previously seemed erroneous for low releases were, in fact, perfectly suited. They had simply never been properly tested because prevailing doctrine dictated that a pilot would be dead before reaching such a dangerously low altitude. The advantage regarding G-force management proved equally significant and revelatory. By courageously holding the dive for a longer period and subsequently executing a more gradual pullout, Riley was effectively distributing the same total G-load over an extended duration of 7 or 8 seconds, rather than compressing it into a mere 4 seconds. This critical alteration resulted in significantly lower peak G-forces, hovering around 4.5 gs instead of the perilous 6 or 7 gs, thereby keeping him safely below the dreaded blackout threshold. More importantly, the gradual onset of these forces provided his cardiovascular system with precious time to adequately compensate. His blood pressure could adjust, and he could effectively maintain his anti-G straining maneuvers throughout the entire recovery, instead of having his physiological defenses overwhelmed by a sudden, violent spike in G-force. This groundbreaking technique undoubtedly demanded immense nerve. It required diving deeper into the perilous danger zone before initiating recovery. However, the underlying physics were irrefutable. Lower, more gradual pullouts were demonstrably both safer for the pilot and significantly more accurate in their bombing results than the established doctrine that was tragically claiming the lives of pilots week after week. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, had, in fact, been diligently conducting wind tunnel research on bomb trajectories since as early as 1941. However, no one had previously conceived of applying their extensive data to ultra-low altitude releases until Riley's unconventional technique compelled a comprehensive and overdue review. When NACA engineers at the renowned Langley Research Center meticulously ran the full aerodynamic models, they uncovered a truth that, in retrospect, should have been glaringly obvious but had been regrettably obscured by decades of entrenched doctrinal assumptions. The standard 2,500-foot release point had never been chosen primarily for its accuracy. Its selection had been driven solely by safety considerations. It was intended to provide pilots with the maximum possible time to recover their aircraft should any unforeseen complication arise. Yet, this crucial safety margin had been calculated under the flawed assumption that pilots would remain fully conscious and entirely capable throughout the entire pullout, an assumption that was now demonstrably false. The detailed wind tunnel data unequivocally revealed precisely why lower releases consistently produce tighter impact patterns. A bomb released at 2,500 feet during a pullout traveled through approximately 180 feet of horizontal displacement before ultimately impacting its target. During this extended flight time, it was inherently subject to wind drift, subtle variations in air density, and the complex aerodynamic interactions occurring between the bomb-stabilizing fins and the turbulent air churning behind the diving aircraft. Even minute variations in release timing, differences as slight as a tenth of a second, could translate into a substantial 15 or 20 feet of missed distance on the target. Conversely, a bomb released at 1,800 feet from a nearly vertical attitude traveled perhaps only 40 feet horizontally before impact. The flight time was dramatically shorter, the trajectory inherently simpler, and consequently, the margin for error was drastically reduced. Release timing variations that would induce significant misses at higher altitudes produced negligible deviation at these lower, more precise altitudes. Further empirical confirmation arrived through meticulous combat footage analysis. The Navy had been systematically collecting gun camera film from every single combat mission since the Battle of Midway, and this invaluable footage contained frame-by-frame records of thousands of individual bomb releases, complete with visible impact points. When dedicated analysts painstakingly reviewed this extensive film archive, specifically examining release altitudes and their corresponding accuracy, the correlation became undeniable. Pilots, who executed their releases below 2,000 feet, whether intentionally like Lieutenant Riley or inadvertently by holding their dives for too long, consistently achieved impact patterns that were a remarkable 40% tighter than those achieved by pilots adhering to the doctrinal 2,500-foot release. The lowest releases, those performed between 1,600 and 900 feet, astonishingly produced accuracies approaching what had previously only been attainable through glide bombing attacks, which were conducted at much lower speeds. The intricate G-force distribution data completed the compelling narrative. Utilizing accelerometers painstakingly installed in test aircraft, engineers meticulously mapped the exact G-loading profiles for pullouts initiated at varying altitudes. A pullout commenced at 2,500 feet necessitated immediate and maximum back pressure on the control stick. The pilot, rapidly running out of precious altitude, was forced to arrest the dive as swiftly as humanly possible. This aggressive, abrupt recovery generated the punishing 6 to 7 G spike that was the primary cause of the debilitating blackouts. In stark contrast, a pullout initiated at 1,800 feet could be executed with significantly greater gradualness, precisely because it began from a lower altitude. While the pilot was undeniably closer to the water, he was also in a more vertical attitude, which afforded the luxury of a longer, more controlled recovery arc. Instead of abruptly yanking the control stick rearward, pilots were now instructed to apply a steady, gradual back pressure, enabling the aircraft to gracefully arc out of its dive over an extended duration. This refined approach achieved the identical change in altitude, but subjected the airframe and its occupant to significantly gentler forces. Crucially, the peak gravitational load remained consistently below 5 gs, a threshold well within the physiological limits, where aviators could sustain full consciousness and continue to execute their duties with unimpaired faculties. Transforming established aviation doctrine represented a formidable undertaking, yet the challenge of re-educating an entire combat air arm to perform the precise inverse of their deeply ingrained muscle memory presented an even more daunting hurdle. Consequently, in June 1943, the United States Navy inaugurated an experimental dive bombing school at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, operating under the direct and meticulous supervision of Commander Flatley. The entire instructional framework was meticulously reconstructed, fundamentally reorganizing the curriculum around what was officially designated the delayed pullout technique, although airmen swiftly coined more colloquial terms such as riding the edge or simply the late pull. The initial and perhaps most profound obstacle encountered was psychological, assuaging the deeply rooted anxieties of seasoned pilots and convincing them that descending closer to the water before initiating recovery was not an act of suicidal recklessness, but rather a demonstrably safer and more effective methodology. The intensive training regimen commenced with classroom sessions that bore a striking resemblance to advanced physics lectures rather than conventional flight briefings. Pilots were immersed in presentations elucidating the intricacies of G-induced loss of consciousness, complete with meticulously prepared charts illustrating intricate blood flow patterns during high G maneuvers and sophisticated graphs correlating the rate of G onset with the statistical probability of blackout. Specialized flight surgeons provided comprehensive explanations detailing the exact physiological mechanisms that transpired within the human visual system when the retinas were deprived of adequate oxygen. The instructors meticulously ensured that every pilot grasped the fundamental principle. This new technique transcended mere courage or inherent skill. It was, at its core, a matter of human biology. The most valorous and proficient aviator, irrespective of their capabilities, would inevitably experience a blackout at 6 gs if the pullout was executed with excessive force and rapidity. The paramount objective was not to heroically combat the crushing G-forces, but rather to intelligently manage them, to distribute their impact over a longer temporal span, thereby allowing the human body to physiologically adapt rather than succumb to incapacitation. Following the theoretical groundwork, the curriculum transitioned into rigorous instrument work. The successful implementation of this novel technique demanded that pilots place absolute trust in their altimeters, particularly in scenarios where every primal instinct screamed for an immediate and abrupt pullout. Instructors guided pilots through repetitive practice sessions within link trainers, which were rudimentary yet effective flight simulators. Here, they meticulously rehearsed various dive profiles repeatedly, continuously verbalizing their altitudes. Passing 3,000, holding angle. Passing 2,500, holding angle. Passing 2,000, sight picture, steady. 1,800, initiating pullout. These incessant verbal callouts served to keep their conscious minds actively engaged and effectively counteracted the insidious tunnel vision that frequently led to a perilous loss of altitude awareness. Pilots continued this intensive practice until the callouts became entirely automatic, a rhythmic verbal cadence that would persist even under the most extreme combat stressors. The practical flight training component introduced the new technique through a carefully orchestrated series of graduated steps. Initial flights involved practice dives conducted without any bomb ordnance, with pilots initiating their pullouts at 2,200 feet, merely 300 feet lower than the recovery altitude prescribed by the obsolete doctrine. Instructors flew alongside in chase aircraft, providing continuous, real-time altitude updates via radio. Pilots diligently learned to discern the specific visual cues that corresponded precisely to 1,800 feet, the apparent size of the target, the distinctive geometry of the horizon, and the precise sight picture that unequivocally signaled "Now!" They meticulously practiced the gradual pull-out, mastering the art of applying steady back pressure instead of instinctively yanking the stick. Furthermore, they honed anti-G straining maneuvers, which commenced prior to the pullout and were maintained throughout the entire recovery arc. They were taught to forcefully grunt with each exhalation, simultaneously tensing their leg and abdominal muscles to effectively trap blood within the upper regions of the body. By the close of August 1943, the Jacksonville facility was successfully graduating pilots who consistently demonstrated the capability to release their ordnance from altitudes ranging between 1,700 to 900 feet, achieving circular error probable figures consistently under 40 feet, and, remarkably, experiencing zero-G-induced incidents. While this enhanced training regimen necessitated an additional 3 weeks compared to the previous curriculum, the resultant improvements were irrefutable and profound. Squadrons that subsequently received these newly qualified pilots reported dramatic accuracy enhancements, ranging from 35 to 50%, when compared to squadrons still employing traditional dive bombing techniques. More significantly, the training accident rate plummeted to virtually zero, marking a monumental leap in aviator safety. Despite the undeniable efficacy of the new method, pilots still grappled with an inherent fear. Diving to a mere 1,800 feet before initiating recovery demanded every last vestige of their discipline and mental fortitude. Nevertheless, they were no longer perishing at the alarming rates previously observed. The technique unequivocally worked, and the Navy was now faced with the urgent imperative of deploying this revolutionary method across every carrier air group operating in both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans before the advent of the next major offensive. The delayed pull-out technique underwent its inaugural large-scale combat evaluation during Operation Forager, the pivotal invasion of the Marianas in June 1944. Task Force 58, a formidable armada comprising 15 fleet carriers, converged upon the Philippine Sea, with every single dive bomber squadron having been rigorously retrained in the new doctrine over the preceding 8 months. On June 19th, amidst the chaotic aerial engagements that would later be immortalized as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bombers faced their ultimate and decisive validation. Japanese carriers unleashed massive aerial strikes that utterly overwhelmed American combat air patrol controllers, necessitating an urgent and unprecedented directive. Dive bombers were ordered to pivot from their primary mission of attacking enemy ships to intercepting the incoming Japanese strike packages before they could inflict damage upon the American fleet. What ensued was an unparalleled test of bombing accuracy executed under the most intense and unforgiving combat conditions imaginable. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage, leading Bombing Squadron 10, VB-10, from the venerable USS Enterprise, spearheaded an attack against a formation of Japanese carrier bombers at an altitude of 12,000 feet, a height where dive bombing had previously been deemed, at best, marginally effective. Employing the delayed pull-out technique, his pilots initiated their dives from this elevated altitude, maintaining their descent directly through the heart of the Japanese formation, and releasing their ordnance at altitudes consistently below 2,000 feet, while still hurtling through the air at speeds exceeding 280 knots. The resultant bombing accuracy proved absolutely devastating. Post-action analysis credited VB-10 with the destruction or significant damage of 23 Japanese aircraft in a single pass, accuracy rates that would have been utterly unattainable with the outdated high-release technique. Ramage's own bomb struck a K-torpedo bomber with such astounding precision that the ensuing explosion scattered wreckage across a quarter-mile radius. Significantly, not a single pilot within his squadron reported even a partial blackout during their recovery maneuvers. The comprehensive data emanating from the Marianas operation painted a definitive picture of the technique's success. Dive bomber squadrons employing the delayed pull-out technique achieved hit rates of 32% against actively maneuvering warships, a stark improvement compared to historical averages of 18 to 22% recorded during earlier naval engagements. During the critical strikes against Japanese carriers on June 20th, bombs released from altitudes below 2,000 feet accounted for an astonishing 14 of the 18 direct hits credited to American dive bombers. The Japanese carrier Hyo, for instance, sustained 3 rapid, successive bomb strikes from VB-2 pilots, all of whom released their ordnance between 1,500 and 1,850 feet, punching through the flight deck with such surgical precision that 2 bombs entered the very same elevator shaft. The carrier sank within a matter of hours, and subsequent post-war analysis of the wreckage revealed impact patterns tightly clustered within an astonishing 50-foot circle, a level of accuracy that would have been considered utterly impossible just 18 months prior. Pilot survival statistics exhibited equally dramatic and heartening improvements during the 6-month period following the widespread implementation of delayed pull-out training. Incidents of G-induced loss of consciousness plummeted by a staggering 91% across all carrier air groups. Furthermore, combat loss rates attributable to dive accidents receded to statistically insignificant levels, fewer than 1 pilot per 1,000 sorties, a stark contrast to the alarming rate of 15 per 1,000 observed during the grim early months of 1943. The technique had unequivocally resolved the debilitating blackout crisis. Yet, its impact extended beyond mere safety. It had fundamentally redefined the operational capabilities of dive bombing. The newfound ability to accurately release ordnance from ultra-low altitudes meant that dive bombers could now effectively engage targets that had previously necessitated the deployment of multiple squadrons. Single aircraft could now achieve mission-killing damage on destroyers. 2 plane sections possessed the capability to disable cruisers. By the time the Okinawa campaign commenced in April 1945, the delayed pull-out technique had become so thoroughly ingrained and institutionalized within dive bomber doctrine that young pilots arriving from training command were entirely unaware that any alternative method had ever existed. They had been rigorously trained to ride their dives down to 1,800 feet from their very first training hop, and by comparison, the old high-altitude releases seemed recklessly inaccurate and archaic. The conclusive statistics from the Pacific War unequivocally demonstrated that dive bombers trained in the delayed pull-out technique successfully sank or damaged 47% more enemy shipping per sortie than squadrons employing the pre-1943 methodologies. They achieved this remarkable feat with demonstrably lower loss rates, significantly improved pilot survival, and an unparalleled level of accuracy that profoundly transformed the dive bomber from a broad-area weapon into an instrument of surgical precision. The technique that had initially appeared suicidally dangerous in 1943 had, by war's end, become the undisputed standard by which all other bombing methods were meticulously measured. The pilots, who had learned to place their trust in the immutable laws of physics over their primal instincts, who had rigorously trained themselves to sustain those screaming dives for just a few precious seconds longer than every nerve in their bodies demanded, had, in essence, rewritten the fundamental rules of naval aviation. And they had achieved this profound transformation by mastering the art of pulling out late.